Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Arraya Solutions podcast. The featured topic today is managed services. I am Scott Bryan, Arraya's Cybersecurity Director, along with Arraya's Director of Managed Services, Dan Abondi, and Mike Pikarski, Arraya's Enterprise Security Architect. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
So, Dan, tell us about the topic at hand here and why we're talking about managed services today.
We are talking managed services security, and it's a timely conversation because we're seeing a lot more interest, primarily because of the skill shortages gap in the market, and the overall understanding and background and history of certain team members that are required to really properly run a security operation for an IT organization. We're seeing, again, a lot of interest. It's really forcing our customers to consider or reconsider managed services as opposed to the traditional route of providing security services.
Yeah, I mean, with the skills gap you were talking about too, what we're really seeing is there's a lot of kids coming out of school with college degrees in cybersecurity, but those tier 3, high level analysts that really can support and drive high functioning teams and support the sophisticated software tools for that matter that are being implemented. That's really where we're seeing the gap.
Yeah, I would even add to that too. We're seeing a gap at the strategic leadership level. I mean, security is one of those fields where you can't just come in as a manager. You really have to have a background. You have to have lived it for a while. So that overall strategy, the VCSO role, you're just not seeing them anymore. And you're seeing a lot of demand for that in the market because not only can customers not necessarily do it with an on-prem team, they can't plan, to build what's new architecturally.
Yeah, I mean, so Mike, you work with a lot of our customers that have managed security services through Arraya and have some different dynamic needs to support their different tool sets. And specifically, can you talk about some of the advantages in from a managed service to really getting the high fidelity and value out of some of these pretty expensive security tools customers have invested in?
Sure. So I think regardless of the tool set, security tools tend to be relatively complex. Even if they have a sleek UI, what they can do, one size doesn't fit all parts of the business even. So instead of just turning on a rule here and expecting it to take effect, you're going to have to manage different parts of the business different than others. And then there's the management side of the tool, which takes understanding how the business operates and customizing it there, which you need to understand the tool and you have to understand the business to do. But then there's just kind of keeping the tool alive or the platform alive, which is its own separate discipline that requires deep understanding of the tool itself. So there's those two concentration areas where someone needs to understand the business to tailor the policies and how it's configured, but you also have to need to know the tool itself to keep the lights on, keep it healthy, keep it patched, and having a single resource. Usually, a lot of times in a lot of business areas, they're expecting one resource to wear 6 different hats. So they're not just their SIM guy, they're also their domain administrator and their backup guy at the same time. And the learning curve on a lot of these platforms is huge. So it's very easy to be lacking in at least one of those areas where they can supplement with a managed service provider, if not all of those areas.
It's interesting you bring that up. A lot of our customers have been coming to us. So we do hourly support. We do fully support, kind of a standard monthly model for our customers. But we're seeing a lot of requests for an integration of the two where we roll out the tools. They have an administrator in place who's skilled in certain areas, but they don't necessarily have comprehensive understanding across the board. So they do some of the work, but then they want us to also fill in as an advisor. And they say, well, we're going to do these few things. Is that going to break anything? What are the risks here? So we're frequently, getting a lot of those requests and fulfilling a lot of those requests.
Yeah, I think, the tools that we're talking about specifically supporting and using to engage with our clients, they are inherently some of the more complex and busy tools in an IT environment, right? I mean, they're taking information and from outside sources, threat feeds, external data dumps, to reputation databases, things like that, as well as taking information from multiple log sources and endpoints that are all changing and dynamically connecting from different locations and different networks at any given time, and all of that data is relevant to the security information event management system. So to think that really it's something we spend a lot of time educating on, which is why we're on this right now talking about it, right? But it's something really that I don't think customers necessarily understand immediately when they get involved in scoping and planning for an implementation project for some security products and software, because the idea is that the thought and the consideration is, all right, we're at risk, we have a threat, we need a tool, and we're going to get it and then install it, and then the threat's covered. And really, that's not the mindset that customers should have. The thought should really be, we have a threat and an exposure, we need a tool to help mitigate and remediate against that threat, and that threat will forever be evolving and changing, because that's the nature of threats. And so therefore the tool and the use of the tool is going to have to be continuously evolving and changing to even stay in front of the intention that the intended purpose you had for the tool to begin with.
Right. So I think we were talking about the other day, but I think it's relevant here, is like, it's one thing to have a endpoint, an EDR administrator or a SIM administrator or analyst, but it's another thing to have somebody that's managing the life cycle of the program around it, right? And even that is another piece that people are turning to their providers for. What should we be looking for is one of the common questions I think we hear. And there's a lot of people know about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, or these different frameworks that say all the different permutations that are known of types of tactics and techniques that an attacker might make. But if you have nothing, which one are you starting with? And I think that's where they can rely on that relationship that's baked or built from a managed service partner, where, okay, well, these are the types of things we're seeing, so we should probably focus on these next three things and build that into a cycle so that over time it gets more and more mature, instead of just trying to play the game of whack-a-mole, right?
Well, it's not just what they should look for, but it's what they shouldn't look for as well. I mean, that's a big piece of what we do. We see a lot of customers that have security in place, or they have monitoring in place, or they have alerting in place, and all they're getting is basically noise. Right. Makes it really difficult to separate the true risk, or the triage higher priority risk, from just random noise that exists. So tuning those policies and keeping those alerts really fresh and ensuring they're going after what you really need is key to this. And that's not necessarily a skill that relates to a tool. That's really a skill you develop over time as an architect or an engineer.
100%.
Yeah, and I think a challenge there too is in the reality, right? No matter what, there always needs to be someone on the client side that is a direct point of contact and a technical leader that the managed team, specifically the managed security folks, can interact with, right? Because there are certain activities and decisions that have to be made by individuals that work and are involved in the business itself, and really need to take best recommendations and technical advice from their providers. But it's always, I think it's very important to have a champion, and at least somebody that understands the business impacts of the technical decisions, always in the loop from the client side. And that kind of touches on something we were talking about, Dan, before we started recording, is some of those add-on services that aren't necessarily included, or that have to be really considered and scoped differently for managed engagements. Like we were talking about, incident response and disaster recovery, and the different ways managed services can support those business needs, but also how undiscussed and lack of visibility into the specifics around those areas can really put customers at risk with their providers.
Yeah, are you speaking more to like liability, cyber liability insurance, or just in general?
Well, what I mean is that there's a lot. Sometimes there's assumptions. A lot of times on the client side, that providers are doing things and providing certain, for instance, incident response plans and policies and procedures, and or disaster recovery policies and procedures that are specific to the business, right? There's sometimes an assumption that, okay, the managed provider does X, Y, and Z, so backups are covered or recoveries are covered, or they're doing validation. And what we were talking about is that the importance for clients to really be specific with their managed providers to outline, exactly what they are getting, so they can make sure they communicate that properly.
That's a really important point, and it really emphasizes the way we try and work with our customers in terms of roadmap development across the board. Being transparent is really critical. We engage customers a few different ways. We provide subsets of services, or we provide fully managed. And then probably the third category would be fully managed that's not necessarily comprehensive. So in the case of piecemeal service, it's piecemeal service. What you see is what you get. In the case of fully managed, we are customers' IT. We recommend that they cover every avenue in terms of security and vectors. Whether or not they choose to do that is really up to them to a certain degree. Depending on the engagement of the customer, we may not necessarily pursue that engagement if they decline certain aspects of security. We need to ensure a certain baseline. And then again, we have our third category of customer, and that's really the fully managed place where they do implement all those recommendations. But again, getting back to the point, it's really important we be transparent with our customers and ensure they understand what they're not getting, how they're not covered, what those risks are. We have customers, for example, well, I shouldn't say we, there are customers in the world that have MSPs that have help desk as their primary service, and they assume that somehow covers security. Or they have, backup, and that somehow covers security, or that backup covers disaster recovery. They're two separate things. There's a dotted line relationship. But again, that gets back to the idea that we state very specifically with the customer, both contractually and verbally, and remind them frequently if there's a gap, what it is that they're actually getting and what it is they need.
Yeah, and I think, to that point, right, I think for viewers and listeners, it's important to hear that and understand that you need to be specific and and prescriptive in the services that you're consuming from your providers when it comes to your business liabilities and your business continuity requirements. If you have contractual obligations and things like that to your own clients, it's important that those things get communicated and passed down to your managed providers. And
oh no, please. Sorry. There's two key questions to that. So, something that customers really have to ask their MSPs or potential MSPs are, what do I not have, right? But there's a follow-up question to that which is, what do I not have that you don't offer, right? Because just because an MSP says, you're covered, that may mean, well, that we cover everything that MSP does. It's not necessarily that MSP covers them comprehensively. So if that MSP doesn't do backup and they don't have backup, they have to answer that question two different ways.
Right.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so that kind of, that point really leads us into what we were talking about as well with cyber insurance, right? And so, that's kind of where I'm going with that, as far as being prescriptive and specific with the managed providers to make sure that you have an understanding of what services you're getting, where the liabilities lie, where the responsibilities are. So when you're interacting with your own business partners, you can communicate accurately, right? Where you have coverage, where you have gaps, and make sure that you're fulfilling your compliance obligations and your contractual obligations.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of those requests where customers need help completing those forms. They need inputs. It's really interesting. It's I don't know if customers truly understand the nature of this, but if you don't, the cyber liability insurance, if you don't necessarily cover all those gaps, you may not be offered liability insurance. If you cover some but not all, you may have a higher premium. In the event of an actual attack, my understanding, Scott or Mike, maybe you can reinforce this, but it's becoming more frequent that providers are auditing. So there could be a case where you complete one of those forms incorrectly, either intentionally or not, undergo an attack and are denied coverage or full coverage because your documentation was in fact wrong, following an audit from the policy provider.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those risk forms are there for a reason, right? When the underwriters are reviewing it, and that's, we're seeing to that point, right? We're seeing situations where businesses are just not being offered policies going into 2023 for multiple reasons, but mainly because of just missed basic foundational security principles, right? Multi-factor authentication is a big one. Backups is a big one, and now they're asking specific questions around the tool sets that are being used to correlate alerts and to monitor tools, to monitor endpoint detection and response products. So definitely a big drive from the insurance industry pushing down to the businesses to harden up a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to one of our strengths too, and that the fact that our managed service is very integrated with the lines of business. So we see this a lot where customers are missing, for example, MFA. Well, we can fill in that gap for you, no problem. That's an easy one. And certainly relative to some of the security tools we're talking about, it's incredibly cheap. Same goes with SSO or plugging in a scanning tool or having penetration testing done. Any of that really can be plugged in. It's something we can really do for our customers, and frequently, it comes up in conversation a lot, but we're finding that the need for coverage or reduced coverage is really driving a lot of those conversations. Not the ideal way, but it's getting the job done.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, right? Contractual and compliance requirements are still driving services and foundation security principle adoption. We're shocked to see that, where there's basic things that customers haven't been doing, and now there's a regulatory requirement, and it's immediately taken care of. So it does show you that the business really does drive and dictate a lot of these security decisions, and IT is really kind of out of the loop on budgeting and planning for security and risk management needs of the business, and it's getting more and more that way.
Yeah, and what was I think that the core change here is that previous conversations talking about managed security or security projects as a whole. One of the first questions, regardless of what the tool is or what the service is, our first questions historically always is going to be, what are your regulatory requirements? But question number 2 is
what
now
contractual obligations.
Yeah, do you have cyber insurance, and what are they requiring? Or what are your third party vendor requirements? And people may have been getting away the last 15 years saying, well, I don't have to, I'm not responsible to anybody, but if you have that policy, now you are. So welcome to having some requirements. And now we're seeing those people that need to make those adjustments, and often will engage our advisory services to try to navigate that for them, because it's a new world for them.
Yeah.
And in reality, it is based on where the premium prices have gone, the multipliers and the reduced coverage that they now provide. The implementation costs of the tools are definitely less than the risk, and I think we have been talking about that for some time in the industry, kind of frustrated by some of the cyber insurance offerings that were out there pre 2020. So, I don't think it's a mistake that that there's been I think a change in the impact of ransomware and those things. The wide scale impact of those things.
I think it's important to, I've just been looking at a lot of these forums because customers have been sending them. So I'm getting a lot more exposure to them. And I've seen them before, but it's just kind of fresh in my head from the last couple of days. They give, if you do check off all those boxes, they give a bit of an illusion of false security, in my opinion. And maybe, Mike, you can speak to this a little bit. But, I see questions like, how often do you do patching? This is one of the simplest ones. And you say, well, you do it monthly. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean the patch took. You try to do patching. Did it need a reboot? Did it need a restart? Did it pass over? What version are you on to begin with? There's a lot of hidden questions in there that could really present a vector for attack. And that kind of gets into the idea of, a managed service, a basic managed service versus maybe security engineering, and where the value is in those, services that we do beyond just rolling out a tool.
Right, and I think that this is like a classic scenario that we would see from any sort of requirement, right? You're going to have people out there that they just want to do the bare minimum to check the box. And with that comes, to what you guys were saying before, the assumption that that's all they need to do. And it's a lot of times, from the jaded security professional perspective, it might be, you might say, oh, this is a lazy something, or they're just trying to get the lowest hanging fruit. But really, a lot of the time, it's just like we were saying before, they're not educated about, you need to have a program around this. It's one thing to say we schedule patches for the last Wednesday of the month every month. But it's another thing to say we have a process around to make sure to QA those patches, see what the differential is between the ones that we pushed out, test to make sure that they actually succeeded, find any of the fallout, and schedule and try to push them out or figure out what additional remediations. So it's how mature is the program around that, the life cycle around each of these components of your overall security program. There's more than just the one bullet point. And I think that's what's missed. And that's where they could leverage offloading that to a provider instead of having to build that and staff that up themselves, which could be multiple FTEs to keep each of these programs running. They can, for a fraction of the price, offload it to a provider to handle the whole life cycle.
Yeah. And you picked, patching as the example, and that's the easiest of pretty much all the categories.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it is the most frustrating one for most IT teams. And I wonder, why do you think that is? Why do you think, just little side question, like, why do you think patching is so difficult?
I can take a stab at that one. So a lot of it is the way MSPs engage customers, who owns the patching tooling, and how it's set up. So we're a pretty big Microsoft shop. We're tightly coupled with Microsoft. We use SCCM a lot, so we roll it out or we use customer implementation. SCCM is a great tool. It's really good for internal patching. There are some challenges doing it externally. There's a lot of setup involved. There's a lot of tuning that goes into it, and it's got to be tuned very well and maintained to be good at patching. That being said, there are some alternative tools that are more friendly to patching externally if you're not necessarily embedded in the customer environment. Not to make the argument that tools are magic and they do everything for you, but the tools that I'm talking about, I won't name names, but they do one thing and do one thing really well. They can't necessarily fulfill everything that SCCM does, but as far as just the patching goes, they're very efficient at doing that. So they provide great reporting. They provide an escalation path when we have to contact a system owner or a hardware owner for a reboot. It has an escalation path where if they don't respond within a certain amount of time, it does something else. Maybe it emails their supervisor or emails them again, but it forces that. And then to Mike's point too, it produces that Delta report to say, of your 3,000 systems, this many were patched, this many failed. It also schedules time where we have to be available. We have to be ready for these patching updates. Roughly 8 to 12% of patches fail, right? So these could be on manufacturing equipment, live equipment, where they only have, they budget, 5 minutes for a reboot and maybe 15 minutes of troubleshooting, and after that, roll back and get back to work and get the line going again. So that's where you see a lot of the problems. It's really in the tooling and the way the tooling's set up. And again, really emphasizing that there's some good solutions out there that just handle the patching piece with respect to data escalations and all the common scenarios that we get with customers. And I would say that the last thing too there is customer compliance. So depending on the patch type, we need to reboot a machine. Customers don't want us to just have authority to automate a reboot. We can do that. We do that with some customers. But again, if this is live stuff, if it's on an assembly line, we work with petroleum and gas, we can't just shut those things down. They need to go through a chain of accountability and authorization before we do it. And there's often times where customers, and this is the point, never want to shut them down and never do the reboot. So then we're in a scenario where maybe the patch is applied, maybe we're trying to schedule a window, but we have kind of a red alert going on where period's gone by and we've got something that's potentially out of compliance. And depending on what that vendor patch is, maybe it's a little GUI update or maybe it's a security update. We've got to communicate with them and make sure, depending on the severity, that they get that done, or at the very least, are aware of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, similar to, Scott and I, we've been through a lot of stuff with SIM in general. So we tend to use that as an analogy for a lot of things. But even that piece, just getting data in, it requires reaching out and touching so many devices that it inherently slows things down. And then wouldn't it be great if we could just say, go out and reach out and touch all these devices right now? But we would also be complaining if there was no change management in place. So once there is change management, now everything's inherently slowed down. So with any of these security changes in the environment, whether it's bringing in log sources, whether it's rolling out patches, there's going to be baked in delays because you hit a hiccup. Now you got to wait for next week's change management window. You have to schedule it. So the delays really stack up. And in order to get on top of all of that, there has to be a tight process, because if you miss next week's, now you got to wait another week. And you have to make sure there's resources available to schedule it Thursday at 2 a.m. or whatever the service window is. So it really compounds. And if you're not on top of filling in these tasks at the right times, you're adding weeks every time you miss that window. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in 2017, all of a sudden, everyone was willing to patch and take their Windows systems offline for as long as they needed to patch for everything that had to be patched, because there was, Eternal Blue had hit the wire and WannaCry was blowing up every Windows machine that was connected to a network across the planet. And I was working with clients then as a consultant, and I had a few that hadn't patched anything in years because they didn't want to, operationally, to Dan's point, they didn't want to take anything down. There was just an overall just pushback regularly on touching any system that was operating properly, right, and patching it at all with anything. And then when WannaCry hit the world, those same clients were like, "Hey, do you have anybody that could stay up all weekend and patch, our 3,000 servers with us, so we can get back online on Monday?" And then, it's interesting how I think we lose track of some of those major events, right? And to Mike's point, like, the further away you get from patching, the longer it's going to take to catch up to patch, to get to the latest level. And that was a wake up call, I think, for a lot of IT shops. And it's there's regularly something like that around the corner. So patch your systems.
Well, Mike I just want to touch on one thing. Mike brought up a great point around change management, and it gets back to the consultative and advisory approach that we have and how we're integrated with these things. You can set up a really poor escalation path that slows things down, but it can also open another vector for an attack. The classic example I use is expense reports, right? You see the chain of approval, the first person approved, I see that and I approve it. I don't look at it. It has a little bit of, it lacks some meaning sometimes. I had an expense report, I won't name the company, it was a consulting company, and I added an extra zero, and I was surprised to see it got approved all the way through. I think that can happen when you have something as simple as patching or other change control management protocols where no one's really, it becomes so convoluted and so complicated that no one's really looking at the details to validate their approval. And I think really going in and taking some time to simplify that, being transparent with our customers, and really reducing that flow, to where it makes sense and has a degree of security, because again, it is a soft vector of attack, has a lot of benefit.
We see this often on the advisory side, specifically with any procedures and policies, right? So they get drafted in their initial form. Same thing with a change approval board or a change control process. Gets drafted in its initial form, and that's just the way that the business operates for a while. And there's not, with apps, right? User experience is everything, but with procedures, people forget what user experience is. And so you're stuck with this broken process that people navigate around when it can be enhanced. It doesn't have to be version 0.1 alpha forever. You can iterate on your processes and your change approval process, any of your procedures that you have inside, to tailor it to what actually works for your users, what is agile, and what can actually be flexible. So that's something that I think people as a whole across the industry should keep in mind, that we should treat our the boring stuff, our procedures, the same way we treat our software. We can improve it and enhance it over time.
Then take advantage of new technologies, right?
I like the idea of the usability of change control. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, there's, to Mike's point, right? There's new technology that really makes a lot of these things almost non-existent anymore. Whether you're talking about microservices or machineless, computing. So yeah. Anyway, patch your systems.
Long-winded way of saying patch your systems. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, one of the other areas we were talking about is identifying and just discussing the difference between security operations and security engineering. We really the different tiers in service management in a managed security offering. We were talking about some of the, just differentiating between the analysis work, right, threat hunting and things of that nature versus the integrations and the overall operational support. Mike, from your perspective, when you talk about like breaking those things apart, and from a priority perspective, and where customers should focus on getting their value out of the tool sets that they're using. I mean, we talk about this a lot, that the effort going into the care and feeding of the systems is sometimes lost. What do you think the percentage breakdown is that clients should consider, resource time spent on operating their environments versus consuming and using the data their environments produce?
Yeah, so I don't have any fast numbers to work on, but I think it's going to depend on what the actual environment is and how complex that system is. But I would say the bulk of the time should be spent on the analyst side of massaging the policies, getting value, making sure your alerts are high fidelity, tuning out that noise that Dan was talking about before, and then that none of that, with the keeping in mind that none of that can be done if the system is not healthy. So while you might spend more time on the analyst bucket of getting value out of the data coming in, it's more critical to make sure that the system is healthy, if that makes sense. You've got more time consuming on actually doing something with the tool. But if the system itself is not healthy, patched, all the services are consuming data the way that they're expected, they're not failing, and you're keeping on top of system notifications when this service keeps failing for some reason, or We have this constant exception that we have to make. If you're not doing that, then everything you're doing over here doesn't matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, it does. And maybe go into a little bit of why, right? So we talk about like failed, log sources,
Right. Yeah.
and things like that, right? So how does that impact the
so
fidelity?
it's back to our favorite analogous system here is a SIM, right? We're sending data in. You can make all the rules that you want about what happens when you see a connection over this port and then a successful login here followed by PowerShell over there, that chain of events. But if your Windows logs are not sending you process information, they're just sending you successful logins, and your firewalls stop sending the data in, or your switches stop sending the data in about successful connections, that alert's never going to trigger. So it might not have somebody staring with eyes on glass 24 hours a day about, hey, is my firewall sending logs right now? But that is why keeping the lights on, keeping the connections intact, and those services running clean, that is the prerequisite for any of your detections actually making sense of the data. But it's a larger level of effort to build out those rules, but they mean nothing if the data is never hitting the rules. That makes sense.
It does. And I think, the point there too, right, is that, again, we talked, a lot of clients are very concerned about who's watching the dashboard, right, of alerts coming in, and what are they doing immediately when an alert comes in. Obviously very important. However, a waste of time if you could have 20 people looking at the screen and have horribly tuned alerts, and have 20 people running around chasing 20,000 alerts, harassing your user community, going down rabbit holes because they have an incomplete picture of what's going on inside the environment, right? And so from a managed services perspective, something that we really try to stress is the importance of focusing on that, the health, the care and feeding of the security tools themselves, the controls themselves, making sure that the policies are set right, that they align with the business needs, making sure that the logs and the audit information is coming in the way that you need to see it. If you have specific requirements for HR or for your contractual obligations or things like that, to prove that certain control is in place, making sure that that is regularly checked, and that you don't find out right at the end of a quarter that the logs that you need to be compliant with your requirements have failing for some time, as an example, right? So those things are the care and the feeding elements of managing the security controls. And
that's
no, go ahead. And that's like Michael said, is we see that as significantly important and a lot of times overlooked. But obviously, like Mike said, if you're not doing that, energy and resources spent on watching the dashboards is really just an exercise in futility.
It gets back to that conversation we were having around, how we engage customers, what they're asking for, and being transparent with them. So, we've, and a lot of companies do this, kind of write some contracts where customers ask for just deploy the tool for us, and that's kind of it. And you'd see that normally at an MSP is like a tier 1 offering. Sometimes they tier it out, sometimes they have different buckets of ways of doing that, or a fixed cost. We really want to get out of that, not that we do it frequently or now at all, but we really want to have some degree of ownership and maintenance built in. So we don't necessarily want to have a tier 1 where it's nothing. We want to have our bottom foundation of where we will engage with a customer also includes checking policies, keeping things maintained, keeping things up to date, as opposed to here's the tool, here's the as-is documentation, run it however you want, or just tell us we're going to run it weekly and here's the information. It doesn't have a lot of value that way unless there's a really high-level alert that comes in and we can jump on it, but it's not delivering the kind of value and the kind of partnership that we want with our customers.
Yeah, so much so that typically these projects and agreements are baked around the specific use cases that we want to focus on. Because if we had an analyst sitting at a desk that's responding the same way to every alert that comes in, then we'd have to have 400 people sitting at the desk to respond to those, because there's so much noise, especially on a new SIM. And if you just leave it in that state, you're never getting. You need a team of detectives to figure out what's actually real. You know what I mean?
Well, you did, however, check off that box in the cyber liability insurance form.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and that points to that. That going with that checkbox should be a life cycle of maturing whatever that checkbox is for.
Yeah, you know. I think that gets into another related topic. I don't know if we want to cover this now, but it's I just had a meeting a little while ago. Cybersecurity, managed cybersecurity, is expensive. Now, if you compare that to what it would take to do, FTEs and manage that kind of group, it's relatively a bargain. But as a total cost, it can be very expensive to some of our customers. And I think all the stuff that you're talking about, Mike, really reinforces it's not just the cost of a tool license and running the scan automated, 2 times a week or whatever the number of times is. It's the aggregation of the data, setting up the policies, provisioning the environment, and then doing the actual analysis, which I think is the key.
Yeah, and engaging with you to the point that we were talking about before, why it's so important to have a stakeholder on the client side engaging with you and saying, here's what we think might be next inside the tool. Not necessarily here's your next purchase, but here's what we think might be the next step inside the tool. What are your thoughts? And we really need some buy-in from that side, because there may be something changing or some other concern somewhere else in the business that they need to say, well, that's great, but can we do this and this first? If you're just checking the box and leaving it to the provider with no back and forth, are you really getting the best value out of it for your company?
Well, yeah, so that could really open up that conversation. Sorry, Dan, to other members of the business, right? So whoever our client contact is, works with other business people with business stakes, right? That might need different reports, different information out of the tools, right? Working with executives to produce, key performance indicators, to incorporate them into reports, to show where spends are going, demonstrate, capability, potentially even include in, client facing information from a customer's perspective, showing a customer the cybersecurity tools and capabilities they have in place. These are all things that we're hearing about and working with our clients on. So that's just another element when you have a provider that you can actually deliver on content creation and doesn't have to click around and figure out how to generate a report.
Right. And one of the other pieces to the spend, right, or the cost of the services. You could staff up and say, I'm going to take the hit on hiring 2 full-time employees, get them up to speed on the tools, or buy people that already have the skills, right? But is there somebody in place that can lead those people to get the value out of the tool? Like we were just saying before, somebody has to oversee this program and push it forward. Is the person purchasing the service in that position to lead the team to get the value out of it? Because it's one thing to pay for the skills, it's another one to direct the skills to get the value out as well. And that's where a lot of the value is in hiring an MSSP, is that they know where you need to go and can guide you into where you need to go, and they have the skill set to do it. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. Yeah, it also avoids the problem of, you mentioned hiring 2 new FTEs, getting them up to speed, maybe getting them certified, going through that. The odds of a backfill in today's, climate are pretty high. I would put them somewhere, probably around 20% for the security profession. Maybe that's my opinion. That's not a valid stat or percent. Maybe Scott, a bit better, but I'm seeing a lot of it, and that's why we're getting contacted.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining me, Dan and Mike. I think it was a really interesting discussion. Thank you all to all of our viewers. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Arraya Insights podcast. For more information on managed security services and other technology topics, check out arrayasolutions.com to view our blogs, expert Q&A videos, and other podcast episodes.